I'm Lance Jasper Jones. I'm here with Megan L. Coulter, and we represent Jasper House Warriors. And today, we want to talk a little bit about therapeutic approaches.
All right, so what is a therapeutic approach, right? A therapeutic approach is like the way a therapist navigates or guides you through the therapeutic experience. Oftentimes it's individual. It is extensively trained in this modality, and it's very sometimes rigid or very structured. I'll say it's very structured in the sense of like from start to finish. It has very specific goals and methodologies in mind. So just like all therapists are different and navigate situations in therapy in different ways, all therapeutic approaches are not created the same, right? So a lot of people may know about Sigmund Freud. Right. For example, a lot of people say that he's the grandfather or the godfather of like psychology, for example.
So Freud basically started psychoanalytical approaches, talking about your ego and your id, and basically what your personal desires are, and that you will have to meet your needs before you can meet anything else.
Right. And a lot of times people who have like a psychoanalytic approach, they deal with a lot of like, you know, like you said, the ego, wanting you to really dig deep and think about maybe your childhood experiences. Maybe there might even be some dream analysis in there. Those are some of the approaches, right? One that's really common that most therapists are trained in and can do and feel comfortable with for the most part is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, we're going to break it down really quickly. So cognitive, dealing with the mind, right? Dealing with the mind and thought processes. Behavior, dealing with your body or actions that you do. So that can be something you do with your body, or it can even be like speaking, right? Because speaking is also an action. And so how those two things like interact with one another. A lot of times therapists talk about something that's called the cognitive triangle or cognitive triad, but the idea is that it's like a triangle, right? And so it's the interaction between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And those things interact and play off of one another. So a lot of times therapists will use that modality, but a lot of times like therapists may have their own that they feel comfortable with, right? So Lance, I'm gonna flip it on you. So what are some of the modalities that maybe like you feel comfortable with or that you like?
So as a developing counselor, you know, I'm in grad school right now. I really took a liking and interest to cognitive behavioral therapy, which was developed by Aaron Beck, you know, sometime in the 60s, basically dealing with how your mind controls your behavior, essentially. And as a person with sickle cell, I felt that having a certain type of perception on what you're dealing with could control how I acted. You know, having a certain type of perception on medication, on certain type of treatments, your nourishment, I felt that really has taken a difference in my life, actually, and how I am able to, you know, control when I am in a crisis and how I'm thinking about it, understanding to stay calm, to deep breathe, you know, because instead of letting your mind just be like, oh my God, I'm in all this pain, understand that it's a certain thing that's happening, you know, and it has a certain lifespan, ultimately. Even though when we're in it, it feels like an eternity. It feels like we'll never get out of it, you know. So really, as a developing counselor, I really took a liking to CBT, you know, and that's really where I'm headed as an emphasis.
Nice. It's a great modality from the standpoint it's easy, it works, it's effective. There's so much research that like backs it up and shows like there's real true results that come out and long-term results that come out of that. For me, I definitely enjoy like CBT. I think that like it's kind of like the industry standard in the standpoint that everyone gets trained in it, everyone knows how to use it to a certain extent. So we talked about psychoanalytic therapy, right? Talked about Freud, talked about CBT,
Let's talk a little bit about Pavlov, you know, Mr. Conditioning.
So behavioral. So just like how we broke down cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a modality that's strictly based off of behaviors, right? And for this modality, you'll typically see it in some sort of like recovery, right? Like recovery programs or addiction and wellness programs. You may see that just in terms of like behavior changing certain maybe addictive behaviors like smoking cessation and whatnot. So that's just like an example. So behavior, we do a lot with our behavior in terms of like Pavlov, right? They ring That's the one, if you guys don't know, where Pavlov had a bell, and whenever he rang the bell, he would feed the dogs.
Right.
And so then the dogs started to associate the bell with being fed, right? To the point where they would start to salivate, right? After a certain amount of time, Pavlov removed the food, right, and just had the bell. And he noticed that when he rang the bell, even when the food wasn't there, the dog would start to salivate, right? So it's changing their behavior, right? We're a little bit more advanced than like dogs or animals, right? But operant conditioning or behavior conditioning is still like something that can be effective when working with clients.
So we talked a little bit about Pavlov. You know, of course, we talked on Freud. Gotta mention Freud. We mentioned Beck with cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, let's talk a little bit about Carl Rogers.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Carl Rogers, I'm very fond of Carl Rogers. He's like my goat, right? My greatest of all time, if you will. He has a humanistic approach, right? And so for him, it's called like Rogerian therapy, right? Or just humanistic approach. And it's one that, as you know, I started off when I was starting off as a therapist, I really gravitated toward it. It felt very natural for me, just in terms of my personality and like who I am and like my personal history. So there's three main components, right? And it's pretty simple, right? But for some people, like, you know, it might be challenging. So the three components to like providing like, you know, Rogers, like client-centered therapy would be genuineness, unconditional positive regard for the client, and then also accurate empathetic understanding, right? So the last one is accurate empathetic understanding. Essentially, me saying I'm not the authority, I'm not the expert in this situation. If we're thinking about a journey, I'm not the captain, right? Like, I'm not driving the car. I'm purely a guide, right? Like, I'm just there with you on the journey as we, you know, reach whatever the goal is, right? So I'm more of like a guide or a companion, right? The companion guide, if you will. And so really understanding like what it is that that person is feeling and experiencing when they're going through various situations, right? So that's the accurate, which is like accurately identifying, right? The empathy, right? So that's putting yourself in someone's shoes. And understanding, like, so putting that all together, like really understanding and taking it in, what that person, in a lot of cases, my clients, what it is to be them, right? Essentially, I'm truly stepping into their shoes and then saying, like, wow, you know, that's hard, right? Or like, wow, I don't know what I would do if I was in that very same situation, right? So that's why it's a very humanistic approach, in the sense that from person to person, you're just connecting, essentially. So that's why I'm very fond of Carl Rogers and the humanistic approach.
I find Carl Rogers and the humanistic approach to be common sense,
right?
You know, and the person-centered approach in therapy, because it's taking the person within a situation and making that person specific, and that is everything. Like, even as myself, living with sickle cell, you know, it's like, yeah, there may be a population of us having sickle cell, but you talk to a person with sickle cell, although we may come up with some of the same stories when it comes to how the hospital treated us, or how that pain feels, like getting hit by a truck all day. However, it affects us differently. We all have our expectations. You know, it affects males differently. As being a man, we, you know, tend to want to be the Leo, as I am. The Leo of the situation, the lion of the situation, the alpha. You know, we want to be caregivers. You know, go-getters.
Protectors.
And protectors. You know, so there's that expectation there, you know, and for a counselor to be able to understand that and tap into that. And for others with their, you know, multicultural expectations, you know, whether you come from a religious home, and what those expectations look like. And that's why Carl Rogers is the GOAT.
He really is. That's
the GOAT. So you have to be empathetic, even when you're not a, you know, psychologist. You have to be empathetic to just your family members, your mother, your father. You might think they're crazy and they don't get you, but they also come from a different time, you know, and they do have your best interests at all times, you know, so just being empathetic to the fact that they're a child, and they're constantly worrying about you, So being empathetic to all of that, being
Right.
empathetic to the baby child in the family who's trying to keep up, but then also has to break away and make his own lane.
Yes.
Because there's the oldest, and the oldest is always going to be in position. And then there's the middle child, the second, and then so as a baby, you have to find your way. But then also the oldest has to stay strong at all times, has to kind of grow up quicker, has to be the responsible one.
Or is expected to be the responsible one, right? That's a great point, because one of the things that came up for me is like Adler. He talks about the birthing order, right? And the importance, or kind of the expectation of the oldest versus the middle child and the youngest, right? For example, let's say if you have like 3 kids in a family, right? But there can also be variations if there's more than 3 children, right? So Adler definitely talks about the birthing order. So I think you hit the nail on the head when you brought that up about expectations. Another thing that I thought of as you're mentioning that is Erik Erikson, which is yes, he is another theorist who focuses a lot on like life cycles, right? So like our life cycles, we all go through different phases, stages and phases of life. And so dealing with, as I work with kids and families, right, I often bring in Erikson and like the stages of life, just to help kind of kids better understand maybe what they're experiencing and going through. For example, teens, right? When you are a teenager or adolescent, you go through a stage where you're really trying to navigate finding your own individual identity, right? And then the role, right, that you are expected to assume in the family. And a lot of times that may be very different, right? That could be very, very different, right? And sometimes that can align, right? And then there's like variations, right? It's kind of a spectrum of how that plays out because everyone's different. So when we're thinking about life stages, right? Another example would be when an individual has to navigate retirement, right? Coming into retirement, there's a stage that deals with, when you're exiting the workforce and you have to kind of figure out, who am I now, right?
You're leaving that identity behind. Something you probably was for 30, 40 years, some people 50 years, some people their entire life. And now you get to an age where it's like, I'm leaving that.
Right. You're exiting the workforce, or now your life is transitioning in a different way, as opposed to being like, the cool aunt or the cool uncle. You're now, like an elder in the sense of like, in terms of age, where in terms of Erikson, you're nearing kind of like the end of the life cycle, unfortunately. And a lot of times when individuals are either retiring or entering this phase, they're reevaluating, what is it that I did with my life? What does that look like? And sometimes when I have clients come in who are adults or like elderly or caregivers, right, this is something that comes up.
So these psychoanalytical therapeutic approaches are very interesting, right? They all come from this big tree of psychology, and they all have their own branches. But they have this sort of criteria, I should say, where everything is meeting a goal. So at the end of it all, personally, when you're just dealing with yourself, make sure you're writing down your goals. Even as a person who lives with a chronic illness, with sickle cell, I made sure that I always had a goal. Even when I'm in the hospital, I'm focused on that goal because it allows me now to not focus on the present and what's the traumatic thing that's happening. I'm focused on the after and making sure I'm headed somewhere. That way I don't get lost in the now as far as the pain essentially in that moment, knowing that moment is just a moment, even though it seems like forever. So through all these modalities and these theories, they always have an end goal.
Definitely.
Let's talk a little bit about how these modality theories play a part in our social space every day. Like when we're talking about Pavlov and conditioning, how social media alters how you personally feel, how you behave, but then also within your own environment growing up, and how being conditioned to a certain thing, ultimately you have to break out of that at some point to become something different, to be a part of something different, even all the way down to relationships. So let's talk a little bit about the modality theories and how they play into our everyday life.
Yikes. Ooh, that was a tall order. So in terms of how these modalities play out in our lives, really, in terms of how we navigate, it's all about awareness a lot of times. a lot of these theories are based on the fact that, or based off of the assumption that the individual or the client is not truly aware, right? They're not aware of how their thoughts impact, their actions in the case of CBT, right? Or how their behaviors, right, really impact some other aspect of their life, or how interactions with family members, right, can impact the way that they like navigate different situations. So really, with all these modalities, I think that the common thread in terms of how individuals navigate is like a certain level of awareness. So for example, myself as a therapist, I like the approach. It's called Gestalt therapy, and Gestalt is a German word. It means like whole or form or shape, right? It specifically means shape or form, and the idea is like a wholeness, right? And so one of the biggest things with Gestalt therapy is realizing like the here and now and bringing a lot of awareness to your emotions and to your body, right? So it's kind of like mindfulness, if you will, like being in the moment. And so I feel like for a lot of people or individuals, therapists included, sometimes we are not aware, right, of our feelings or our emotions or our bodies in certain spaces. So I think from the day to day, it's really about awareness, and how those modalities play out is when you're in therapy and you're doing the work, right?
So now we're talking a little bit about psychological fitness and our self-care,
right.
From a modality perspective. How do you, as a therapist, stay psychologically fit?
Ooh. So I do a lot of like what's called cognitive coping, right? So when we're thinking about cognitive coping, so if we're gonna break it down again, right? So cognitive being the mind, right? And coping being like how you navigate or address certain things that might come up for you, right? So cognitive coping for me might be like, me being my own cheerleader, right? Somebody saying like, Megan, you got this, right? Or you can do this. Another thing that's really comforting for me is like me being realistic with myself that, sometimes I say to myself, this too shall pass, right? And what that means to me is it's helpful for me because it's like, I won't be taking this exam forever. I won't be stuck in traffic forever, right? I'm keeping in mind that there's some sort of end to whatever is happening or something that's stressing me out. So that's kind of how I choose to find my balance. For me, it's like a lot about balance, finding my balance. So good question. Oh my goodness.
So basically today, we talk a little bit about our therapeutic approaches and what do they mean personally to ourselves, and how we use them operatively in the world and in sessions. So again, I'm Lance Jasper Jones. This is Megan L. Coulter, and we represent Jasper House Lawyers. See you next time.
But particularly with life stages, right? Erickson does a great job at breaking it down from birth all the way up until like death or death. Just in the sense of like blah blah blah. Sorry. Eric Erickson, also another example of Eric Erickson.
I had that on my shirt.
What on your shirt? What was it?
Eyelash.
What? That's a Leo. So let's see. Eric Erickson, stage therapy. Another example